Good morning. If you'll please open in your Old Testaments with me to Judges chapter 16. Judges chapter 16. When I was 12 or 13 years old, I had a 5-year-old nephew, and he was watching his 12 or 13-year-old uncle to see what would he do, how was he going to respond to these types of things. And I went to his birthday party, and I had this giant bowl of ice cream, as you know I am wont to do. And I'm enjoying that ice cream, and I looked up to his dad and to some of the friends who were around and said, "Oh, I have a brain freeze." And he looked at his steaming bowl of macaroni and cheese, took a big old bite and went, "Oh, brain freeze." Yeah, sometimes we look at others and we're directly influenced by what they do or what they don't do. We want to do the opposite in some cases too. And a lot of times that is the case. Observably, that is true. But I'm not really concerned about the obvious top-level issue of this. I'm a little bit more concerned about when we don't think we're being influenced by those who are around us. This morning I'd like to study some lessons in character from the story in the life of Samson. And of course, that perhaps strikes you as a bit ironic that we would learn character lessons from Samson, who is, by most accounts, not a very great character of sorts. He seems to be lacking in that. His decision-making is broken. Basically, every chapter he's in, he has redeeming qualities, as all do, of course. But the scriptural record really highlights his indiscretions, his problematic choices. And we'll notice that it's almost always tethered to who he is tying himself to. Over and over again. We're going to learn some lessons in character from Samson. But before we read the story in chapter 16, if you have a marker, go ahead and leave it there. Look back a few chapters to Judges chapter 13. Judges chapter 13. I think it's important when we look at the story of Samson and Delilah that is revealed in chapter 16 to remember that Samson was committed to a Nazirite vow first. If you notice in verse 1, and the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. In verse 3 of chapter 13, the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." Then the woman came and told her husband, "A man of God came to me, and his appearance was like the appearance of the angel of God, very awesome. I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name, but he said to me, 'Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. So then drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb to the day of his death.'" Now, perhaps most important for what we need to understand about the Nazirite vow for chapter 16 comes in verse 5. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God. And again, there's lots of interesting tentacles to this story, to the Nazirite vow, to Samson, to essentially what is likely a miracle here that this woman can bear the child that is Samson. But we know from the story of Samson generically that Samson is basically two things. Three. He's a really strong guy. And number two, his power is in his hair. Now, the third thing that we've already referenced is he doesn't make the best choices, right? That's something we do often correspond favorably with Samson, that he does not make wise decisions. But physically, we think of him as strong, and he's got to keep his hair. Even from before he was born, this would be the commitment that he was to keep. And so, when we come into chapter 16 and we notice Samson's decision-making process, which, by the way, was not great from chapters 14 and 15, it continues downward in chapter 16. Read with me in verse 4 of Judges chapter 16. After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, "Seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound, that one could subdue you." We learned something very clear about Delilah, that similarly to Jezebel, her name often brings up the warning bells of this is not a good person. And really, what do we know that Samson knows about her? Basically nothing. In verse 4, but he loved her. Can you guess why? In verse 5, you check his pattern, it's very clear in chapters 13, 14, and 15. But even as revealed in verse 5, the lords of the Philistines come to Delilah, whether she was among them or from a different people, it doesn't matter. She had access to the lords of the Philistines. They found her and they said, "We have a plan." And notice they did not say, "fall in love and live happily ever after." In verse 5, fitting with Samson's character, they said, seduce him and see where his great strength lies, by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. And while it would be nice to paint Samson as this guy who's just going through life and he fell deeply in love with this wonderful, virtuous woman, and she just, out of nowhere and unprompted, sold out all of her values to try to trick, betray, and allow Samson essentially to be humiliated and die, that's not likely. And that's not the story. That's not how Samson has chose woman after woman after woman. It's certainly not in any keeping with Delilah's character. She went for the bribe, and she is out for Samson because she's really out for herself. And so Samson falls for Delilah, but Delilah doesn't fall for him. She is there for one purpose and one purpose alone. Again, not him, not her own love fantasies. It is for herself, for her money. And so Samson has fallen for the wrong person. And Delilah doesn't just betray him. She doesn't just come out for him and then get to know him and they fall in love and live happily ever after. She repeatedly betrays him. Notice she's already asking in verse 6, what is the secret to your strength? In verse 7, Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber. But he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web. And she made them tight with the pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. And she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. It's important to see in verse 9 that she was the one who had the men in the inner chamber. This was not something where Delilah was told as if this would make it better, and it doesn't. But if you wanted to have some plausible deniability, you say, Delilah, if you just give us the secret, we'll do all the heavy lifting. That's not the case at all. In verse 9, she's setting the trap. She put them in where they could ambush him. It didn't work because he lied to her. Relationship strike number 2. But she's to blame. And the second one, we don't really see as much direct influence of her besides her constantly pestering him to reveal his secrets. But she again calls the people to ambush him, and perhaps out of his arrogance and pride, he sees no threat here. But even again, in verse 14, who is the one trying to undo Samson's strength based on his own definition? Delilah. Delilah is not just betraying him to the Philistines, she is firsthand betraying him with her own plans and her own hands. Every single bit of this has Delilah's fingerprints all over it. And he doesn't seem to care. Isn't that baffling? He doesn't just do it once. You think, well, that's pretty bad. My wife tried to betray me and get me killed by our fiercest enemies. And by the way, when we read ambush, we kind of think, oh, it's just Samson on 1 or 2 guys. There is no way, based on the history of Samson's track record, his great strength that led to the bribe of 1,100 pieces of silver per lord of the Philistines that approached Delilah, that they're just kind of going to kindly take him off 2-on-1. This is a violent plan to take down a violent, strong Samson. And he doesn't seem to be fazed by it. And we'll ask why in a couple moments, but this is what happens. But then if you notice, the narrative changes a bit. She's asked 3 times, and every time he's lied to her, which again, this isn't great on either side. But in verse 15, she tries a new tactic, guilt. How can you say I love you when you keep lying to me? Now, my response might be, how can you say you love me if she ever did, and you keep ambushing me? But that doesn't seem to be Samson's dilemma. In verse 17, he is responding to being vexed to death, and so he tells her all his heart. Now, before we read that, verse 16 is the fulcrum here. When she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. So contextually, one of two reasons is causing this surrender by Samson to tell her the truth. Either the guilt of verse 15 or the annoyance of verse 16. Now, it does seem most in keeping that the annoyance had to do with it. But either way, if you take it as a collective, Samson is giving in to Delilah, whether to make his life easier, to stop hearing complaints, or because he really did feel bad for her. It doesn't matter. He finally was worn down. In verse 17, he told her all his heart and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up again, for he has told me all his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. And she made him sleep on her knees. And she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison, but the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. So, I know everyone feels great on this Memorial Day weekend about this wonderful, lovely story that we have here, this love of Romeo and Juliet, of Samson and Delilah, the mutual love, the mutual lies, the mutual ambushes, just like every fairy tale ever goes, right? What is wrong with Samson? What is going through his mind at every step of this? And you can figure it out pretty easily from the first 5 verses of chapter 16 that he just saw Delilah and he fell in love with her based on what he saw. Delilah is motivated by greed, that's clear, and they keep going. But my question isn't just what's the initial burst. My question as a Christian is if something is so obvious after the first mistake, why do we keep falling for it time and time again? What about our character sets us up for something that we know is dangerous and problematic, and yet we don't really do anything effective, if anything at all, to stop it? I think this is where we can learn some lessons from Samson. 4 lessons, and the sermon will be yours this morning. Number 1 is we need to choose our family wisely. And read with me in verse 1. There's a little bit more of Samson's backstory. It's equally unimpressive to the rest. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. The Gazites were told, "Samson has come here," and they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, "Let us wait till the light of the morning, then we will kill him." But Samson lay till midnight. At midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gates of the city and the 2 posts and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. When you think about verse 1, who he chose and why. Verse 4 and 5, who he chose and why. And really, if you read 14 and 15, what his pattern is very clear. And we know 1 Corinthians 15:33, a bit out of context, as Paul's talking about the resurrection, is the idea that our companions do influence us. Evil companions will corrupt good morals. We understand that in theory. Samson should have gotten that too. And yet, what is it that Samson said the 4th time Delilah got him? After he had admitted his secret, as we read through Judges chapter 16, if you look again in verse 20, what did he say? He woke up. He realizes his hair is gone, perhaps, but he says, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." I have a feeling that we know that we should choose our family wisely, that the people who we are around influence us. But knowing something and acting on it are often 2 incredibly different steps, even though you have to have the one to get to the second. And again, I say that, and I wonder if psychology can be helpful here. Most modern psychologists suggest that your personality, your character, your traits, this is not biblical, and this is different from study to study, but as a whole, you are largely like the 5 to 7 or 8 people in your life, whoever you are most close to, who you spend the most time with, and who you look up to the most, that has a direct impact on your day-to-day life. You are an approximation of the closest 5 to 8 people in your inner circle. And so when we say choose our family wisely, we know obviously you can't choose your blood family, for better and worse. You are related to who you're related to. And looking at some of the looks that are being exchanged, there's some worse there. I understand that. But we want to savor the better. And then we say, okay, well, we got to choose our church family. That's also a vital choice. Because who we worship with, who we arm in arm march towards heaven with is crucial. Because Satan's going to try to break us up. We want to make sure we're marching towards heaven instead of away from it. But our family and our focus for Samson isn't necessarily about his tribe. It's not about that he was an Israelite. It's not about that he should have known better. He knew better. He knew what Delilah was, and he didn't stop. My question is, who am I choosing for my actual inner circle? Not in some sort of clique way, not in some sort of annoying, no one else can be a part of my life way. Simply put, there is somebody, some list of people that I am very close to. And are these people that I want to be like? Or are these people that might be pulling me farther from God? If I'm a Christian, I'm going to be considering, is this someone that maybe I would put my chances of heaven on? We talk about this lesson, we say, well, it depends on how you choose someone to marry. That's crucial. It is. Choosing who to worship with, choosing who you're going to marry are pivotal life decisions. But all of us, married or unmarried, in a church, not in a church, looking for one, having found one for decades, have to make a decision on who we spend time with after even those decisions have been made. And this is where I'm afraid sometimes our knowledge that we're influenced by people is sometimes separated from what we do. Advice is given to young married couples, marry someone that you would put your chances of heaven on. That if you had to answer a judgment for the way the other person you're marrying lives their life, would you view that as a positive thing or a negative thing? You know why that works, right? It cuts through all the noise and distraction, all the things Samson was clearly distracted by, and says, is this someone who will help me be in a better standing with God? And I understand that's crucial for a marriage. It's also important in our day-to-day friendships, in our brother and sisters in Christ relationships. Because if I am not being influenced for good, I'm being influenced for the worst. That is a problem. And you say, well, someone needs to step up and be a leader. That's true, we need leaders. But leaders also need refreshing. Sometimes the axe needs to be sharpened. You can't always energize everyone else or your battery will die. God expects us to help each other and to receive help in an ongoing cycle, knowing that he is the one that provides, although we'll have more to say about that later. Unlike Samson, we need to make sure we choose our family wisely. But we also need to make sure that if we have that knowledge, and we say, I need to be better, that there are vices in my life, there are people in my life, there are things around me that I know are a problem and I want to be better. I need to make sure I learn that if I keep doing the same thing over and over, I should never expect different results. Now, people say all the time, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. I understand people say that. Please look into Webster's dictionary. That's not what insanity means. But can we talk about that just for the sake of the sermon this morning, that is insanity? By definition, that means lacking saneness. That might be something that lacks sanity, to do the same thing over and over and expect a different result, but that's not the actual definition. But can we respect at least the thought process there? Samson is tempted over and over by Delilah in the same way. She doesn't even try something different until verse 15. And we say, Samson is a fool. And we laugh at him. He is a fool. But I wonder if sometimes I'm foolish just like him. If I were to ask myself, going back to January, what were all those resolutions? Probably something about not eating ice cream, trying to read my Bible more, trying to do all these things. And I say, I have fallen off the wagon. I say, oh, that makes for every year of my life that I've now failed my New Year's resolutions. The question is why? If I say, I need to grow and be stronger as a Christian, I don't know how to teach, I should learn to teach. I don't read my Bible the way I should, I want to learn more. I don't pray the way I should. I'm not connected to God the way I know and feel like I should be. Is that new? Well, no. Is it understandable to struggle? Of course it is. But if we're not actually gaining, if we're not improving, it might be because while my goals are great, my execution is terrible. And if my execution is terrible, I can be forgiven of that, or maybe it's just a neutral thing of wasted opportunity, but I need to be better in the future. We would tell Samson, would you wake up? She doesn't love you. She is trying to ambush you. Her fingerprints are all over it. At least try something different. And what does he do? He lies to her every time. Why? Why doesn't Samson change? And I think this is true. Even though we would never say it, our actions betray us. What it comes down to is Samson really thought, even the fourth time when he woke up, what would happen? I'll be fine. I've been fine my entire life. I have never reached an obstacle that I couldn't physically overpower. It won't matter. Clearly he does. He says that in verse 20. I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. I'd hope that none of us have the arrogance to say something like that out loud. But I do wonder if I look at my life the last 6 months, going back into December, and I say, I knew I needed to be better at this, this, and that. I need to cut out this sin. I need to put on this righteousness. I need to be this kind of influence. I need to have these kind of people in my life. What steps have I taken to get there recently? And if I haven't gained the way I wanted, what was my next plan? First plan didn't work. That happens. What's plan B? What's my third plan? What's plan C? And if I'm out of plans, I've given up. And then what happens is I wait and I drift from June through December and I realize, I need to grow again. And now it's time to set new resolutions that I'm not going to actually keep because we are flawed. That happens. It's okay to be flawed. It's not okay to not care about it. It's not okay to think, I'm good enough. I'm strong enough. I can get through it. Or maybe worse yet, we tell kids all the time, be careful of the friends in your group, because you aren't going to be strong enough to overpower them. After all, we know evil companions corrupt good morals, but what about for everyone else? The psychology doesn't stop in the brains of 13-year-olds. Those are studies extra-biblical about adults. That's just who we are. That's human nature. We are who we put ourselves around. And so to continue to put myself in situations where I'm tempted to sin, around people who lead me to sin, or at least people who do not bring me closer to God, and to expect that I will somehow end up closer to God anyway, is foolishness, just like Samson was a fool. And we can be better. This doesn't have to be a negative. This can be a positive, because if we try something different, we can have a different result. Isn't it amazing that God has given us a family to lean on? He's literally already identified people among us in this Christian family to look to for leadership. And now, to be fair, Bill, Paul, Clark, and Richard can't spend all day with all of us. As much as they would love it, they don't have unlimited time. So we have to pick some other people. But we all know in our own lives, based on the way we are, our own character, our own choices, and based on God's setup within the church, that there are people I can look to for leadership, for mentorship, and for guidance. It's up to me to put myself around people, not for them to find me. I need to make sure I am looking for these opportunities. And then I need to say, if I'm in a position to be of a mentor to someone that I can help, I need to reach down. And you see, what happens is then we have that cycle. I can't expect different results from the same old actions. Third lesson. I can't assume I'm strong enough. This is the bottom line Samson's problem, isn't it? No matter what, he thought he could come out of it. And again, I don't think anyone here would say that out loud. That would be just crazy. We would just immediately say, pride comes before the fall. That's that. But look at me in the 37th Psalm. Look at me in the 37th Psalm. As I was reading this week about Samson, it kept coming to mind how he kept thinking about himself. How he kept thinking, I can get out of this. And not only should he have been trusting other people for some guidance to tell him, hey, these are bad decisions, Samson. By the way, read the narrative. There's some people in his life, and he doesn't really cater to them. He doesn't listen to them. So it is possible to put myself around good people and not listen. That becomes an arrogance problem. Psalm 37, verse 1. Fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Verse 18. The Lord knows the days of the blameless, and their heritage will remain forever. They are not put to shame in evil times. In the days of famine, they have abundance. Verse 21. The wicked borrows but does not pay back, but the righteous is generous and gives. For those blessed by the Lord shall inherit the land, but those cursed by him shall be cut off. The steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand. 39 and 40. The salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. He is their stronghold in the time of trouble. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him. We have to realize I'm not enough. And yes, if you're wondering, this lesson is in part being aware that we have a mentor program set up within our congregation that just started in May. And it's a perfect time to remind everyone, if you haven't talked to who you're mentoring, let's work on that. Right, but as we talk about these pairs, the idea is we need to pair someone with someone else so we grow in those ties, we can get stronger, we can mutually help each other get to heaven. And that's great. And I also am aware that not everyone's paired with everyone, and we should work on that. And maybe long term we can do that. But even if that system is humming and perfect, we need God. We have to realize there is no man solution to our problems because we are the problem in the first place. You can't fix yourself. That's where God comes in. Does that mean do nothing? Of course not. We have to be faithful. We have to trust God. We have to reach out to him. But notice who is the solution at every turn in the 37th Psalm. The salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. In times of trouble, who is their stronghold? The Israelites, who God gave them? The priests who knew the law? God is their stronghold. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him. Here's the problem when we trust people. Sometimes people let us down. And the problem is, I shouldn't be holding you up. Only God can do that. Can we help each other? Yes. Should we bear one another's burdens? We must. All of these things are crucial and important, but none of them should replace or touch the hem of the garment of the fact that God is our solution. And so I need to ask myself, are the people in my circle trying to fix my problems, or are they pointing me to the one who can? Because there are a lot of people who can fix your problems, or they will claim to. Now, usually they want something in return. Money, flattery, some sort of influence. God just gives. Isn't that amazing? When we help, we take something. We say, well, after all, I've labored, so I deserve my wages. And that certainly is a biblical principle. God has basically only given. Does he demand subservience to his will? Of course he does. God is our refuge from the wicked. The other thing about verse 40 that stands out to me in light of Samson's story is God delivers us from the wicked and saves them. And what did Samson keep doing? Putting himself in the room with the wicked. He was not strong enough to be around the wicked people and persevere. I am not strong enough to be around wicked people, wicked circumstances, and persevere. Stop making that choice. Samson, get out of the house. Samson, stop thinking you're the only one who can do it. Samson, trust in God. He will punish the wicked. He will save, deliver, and protect the righteous. I am not strong enough. And even united, we are not strong enough. Otherwise, God would have told us that. We are here to help each other, not to solve the problems, but to point to the one who can solve the problems, the one who is strong enough, the one who is big enough. And so what do I have to do? I have to persevere. I have to run with endurance. Notice what happens in Judges. I think this is really important. This is our last point, but I do beg you to turn back with me to Judges 16. I want to point something out. In Judges 16, I think we see a bit from the devil's playbook here. In Judges 16, notice what Delilah does. Notice over and over and over again what happens. In verse 9, now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, and she said to them, the Philistines are coming upon you, Samson. In verse 12, so Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Again, in verse 15 through 19, she is complaining after verse 14 the same. She's saying, Samson, don't you love me? You would have told me. And what does she do? Verse 16, she presses him hard with her words day after day and urged him. She was persistent. She endured all sorts of lies, lack of love, lack of trust, lack of any sort of good relationship at all with Samson because she was set on the goal. And you know what happened as a reward for her endurance? She got him. It worked because she didn't quit. You know who lost? The judge, Samson. The person who should have known better. The one who knew God's will, who should have had discernment to judge, is this action right? Is this action wrong? The child of God. The one who knew who he was and should have been. He had kept the Nazirite vow after all, at least in the hair portion. But he didn't have endurance. Satan is not going to stop trying to get you. So we can't stop looking for him and running with endurance from him. How do we have endurance? How do we get our battery up? We use the people God put in our life who can bring us closer to him. We read his words and understand that he is the stronghold, that he is the protection, that it won't work for me. I'm not strong enough. I don't have enough endurance on my own, but I can look to Jesus who did. Jesus ran the race with endurance. We must run the race with endurance too. What does that look like? How do we do that?
Notice at the end of the chapter of Judges 16 first. Then Samson, after his eyes have been gouged and he has been betrayed by Delilah successfully, Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Samson realized in his dilapidated state, there was only one person who could even the score, who could make things right. Who was it? The Lord of Psalm 37, the Lord of Samson, the Lord of us all. Galatians 6, what does it look like? How do I run with endurance? I can be like Jesus in Hebrews 12, 1 through 4, of course. But notice in Galatians 6, do we help each other? Yes. Verse 1, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Verse 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Of course, verse 3, if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Samson perhaps should have examined that. Verse 6, let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Let's not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then as we have opportunity, let's do good to everyone, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Galatians 6, 1 through 3, we're bear one another's burdens. Who does that? Christians who are intimately part of our life. I need to make sure that I choose my family wisely. When I execute this plan, verse 1, I have to keep watch on myself lest I too be tempted. The restoration has to be done in a spirit of gentleness. Sometimes, and for decades, some folks, maybe not here, have tried yelling and hammering at the world to get better. And you know what happens? People don't like that. And sometimes a hammer is needed, but not all the time and only that one method. If something doesn't work, try something different. If you keep failing in the same way, try a different path for success. It would be insanity not to. Certainly we need to realize that I am not strong enough. That's why I need others. Verse 7, I need to realize God is not mocked. I will reap what I have sown, so my new plan needs to be something that will have benefit where it matters in the future. I need to sow in such a way that I will be there for God who can protect me. And then, of course, how do I run with endurance? Verse 9, realizing that weariness is a temptation, that it is a battle. And who am I going to share it with? Verse 10, as I have opportunity, I'm going to do good to everyone, especially those who are of the household of faith. Samson made many poor choices, but when he called on God, God heard his prayer. Isn't that remarkable? We just looked at one chapter of Samson's foolish choices. And yet when it mattered, when he humbled himself, God heard his prayer. And I know I can relate, and perhaps we all can. There are times where we have lived our way, and it looks just as foolish if it was on paper like Samson's was in my life, if my reactions and choices were recorded. Stop doing that. Make wise choices that bring you closer to God. Realize God will hear you if you humble yourself. And what can you do if you're not a Christian? Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And if he is the Christ, I need to confess him as Lord. Be willing to tell everyone about it and to show that in my life. I'll repent of my sins. My way, it doesn't work. God's way always does. I'm going to be baptized, having my sins washed away forevermore, becoming a new child of his on his terms, and to call him my heavenly Father. Or maybe you're a Christian and you look at someone like Samson and you say, he should have known better. I should know better as a Christian. But what will happen if I have sinned, if I find myself in a rut? God will forgive me if I confess my sins. It's wonderful to serve a faithful and just God who will forgive us anytime we confess. Take advantage of God's promises. Take advantage of God's people who will pray with you and pray for you. If we can help you at all,